Welcome to Stories by Jackson. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notifications to encourage me to keep creating more amazing stories. Now, let's delve into the story. The town had no name that mattered to the world beyond its county line. It was stitched into the hills like a secret, where roads curled like lazy rivers and every front yard told a quiet story. A forgotten tricycle, a leaning bird bath, a wind chime that had outlived the one who hung it. Life moved with a hush there, soft as cotton sheets drying on a line. In the pale blue house that sat at the end of Dogwood Lane, Emily Dawson pulled the living room curtains open each morning, as if parting the pages of a book she no longer loved to read. The sun filtered in, pale and tentative, but it no longer warmed her. There had been a time, not long ago, when she would hum while fluffing the pillows, when her feet would move with the kind of rhythm that belonged to someone who believed joy was waiting in the next room. But now her movements were quiet, folded inward. Her grief had long since stopped screaming. Now it simply sat in the corners of her home, content to stay as long as it pleased. The photographs on the wall watched her as she moved, one of her in a yellow sundress, another of her husband smiling with a fishing rod, both pretending time couldn't change what love had built. But it had. Bit by bit, the roots of what once made their home sacred had rotted beneath the surface. She didn't speak of it. She didn't have to. Silence, she'd come to learn, could carry more weight than words ever dared. She hadn't noticed the unraveling at first, not in its fullness. It came in thin slices, like the peeling of paint on the porch railing, like a cough ignored until it became a rattle. Caleb began coming home later, the scent on his collar a stranger's signature. At first, he offered excuses wrapped in charm. Traffic, a client who wouldn't stop talking, a last-minute showing across town. She nodded, believing them not because they were convincing, but because she needed them to be. After the first miscarriage, she had clung to him like the final line of a fading hymn. He was her anchor, or so she told herself. But anchors, when rusted, can pull you under. The second loss arrived quietly one winter morning. No sirens, no hospital room prayers, just a red smear on white cotton and the kind of cry that comes from a place too deep to name. Caleb had stood in the hallway, his face stiff, his eyes dry. "We'll try again," he said, but even then Emily had heard it, not hope, not promise. A formality. A placeholder in a sentence neither of them wanted to finish. From that point on, his presence dimmed like a porch light left on out of habit. He still lived there, still took off his shoes by the door, still placed his keys in the bowl on the hallway table. But the man she married was no longer inside those routines. He had gone somewhere else. And she, quietly, mourned both the babies and the man who no longer held her in the night. She began to sense the presence of someone else before any confirmation made it certain. There was a new polish to his clothes, a crispness to his collar that hadn't come from her hands. He kept his phone angled away, flinched slightly when she walked into the room mid-text, and began to hum songs she didn't know. A woman can feel when the space beside her has been spiritually rented out. And though Caleb never said her name in those early weeks, Emily could see her, imagined her in sharp lines and red lips, a presence more perfume than person. One evening, Emily found a receipt tucked into Caleb's coat pocket, dinner for two at a restaurant that required reservations he had never once made for her. She held the paper in her hand as the kettle hissed behind her, steam rising like smoke from something broken. But she didn't confront him. She couldn't. There was something more terrifying than betrayal, the confirmation of it. That night, when he came home, she kissed him on the cheek as if her lips might still reach whatever part of him remained. He stiffened, smiled tight, and walked past her. And in that moment she understood she was no longer competing for his affection. She was mourning the version of him who had once offered it freely. It was on a Thursday that the unspoken finally settled in for good. Rain had fallen steadily since dawn, painting the world in shades of ash and silver. Emily stood in the kitchen, her hands wrist-deep in a bowl of biscuit dough, when she heard the gravel crunch beneath Caleb's tires. She paused, wiping flour from her fingers with the back of her wrist, and waited. He came in slowly, coat-soaked, hair slicked back by the storm. He didn't meet her eyes. Droplets pattered from his sleeves onto the wood floor, a quiet metronome that seemed to mark something final. "You're late," she said softly, not as accusation but as observation. He gave no reply. He simply moved past her, the scent of unfamiliar jasmine clinging to him like confession. She didn't ask where he'd been. She didn't need to. Her hands returned to the dough, kneading, pressing, folding, not because she intended to bake, but because motion felt better than collapse. In the living room, he turned on the television, the artificial laughter of strangers filling the silence between them. Emily stood in the kitchen doorway, the lights flickering overhead, and wondered how many nights could pass less before a woman forgot what her own voice sounded like when it was used for love. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the roof like a warning, or maybe an elegy. She closed her eyes and listened to it, not for comfort, but for truth. It had been trying to tell her something for a long time, and she was finally ready to hear it. The mornings had become a ritual of endurance. Emily would rise before the sun, as if getting ahead of the day might somehow keep her grief from catching up to her. The kitchen was always dark when she entered it, the light from the porch seeping faintly through the blinds like an apology. She didn't turn on the overhead. She didn't like the way brightness made everything look more hollow. Instead, she lit a single lamp and boiled water for tea. Coffee reminded her too much of Caleb, the way he liked it scalding hot, with too much cream. Tea was gentler. She stood by the window, wrapping her cardigan around her tighter, and watched the wind move through the dead leaves on the lawn. October had never looked so gray. Even the trees seemed reluctant to let go, their branches holding on to the last bits of color as if they, too, weren't ready to say goodbye. The house creaked as it always did, but the sounds felt heavier now, like sighs from the walls. She moved slowly, cleaning dishes that had already been cleaned, wiping counters that didn't need wiping. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about control, the only kind she still had. Caleb had stopped coming home on time. Some nights he didn't come home at all. She never asked anymore. Not because she didn't want to know, but because she already did. The not knowing was easier to carry than his lies. They had become strangers living in the same shell of a life, speaking only when required, their words like furniture, functional, not intimate. And yet she still made space for him. She left his toothbrush on the sink. She folded his clothes, even when they smelled like another woman's perfume. She wasn't stupid, she simply wasn't ready. Letting go of a person you once prayed for wasn't an act of sudden violence. It was a quiet, drawn-out surrender, one breath at a time. She remembered the first miscarriage the way some remember a fire, not just the pain, but the silence that followed. It had happened during the second year of their marriage, just as she'd begun knitting tiny socks and filling drawers with onesies patterned with ducks and stars. They had picked out a name, Samuel, if it was a boy. He'd kicked once, maybe twice, or maybe she'd imagined it. She never got far enough along for it to be obvious. One morning, the spotting started. By evening, her body was empty again. She never forgot that night. Caleb had held her in the bathroom, his forehead pressed against hers, whispering that they'd try again, that it wasn't the end. And she believed him, because believing was easier than breaking. But something changed in both of them after that. The second miscarriage came a year later, quieter than the first. She didn't cry the same way. She simply lay in bed afterward, her hands resting on her belly like a truce. Caleb didn't speak much during those weeks. He went back to work quickly, buried himself in projects, appointments, and his new secretary, Lena. At first, Emily thought he was just trying to stay busy. She told herself that grief shows itself differently in men, that he'd come around, but he didn't. He grew colder, he laughed less. He started to turn away from her in bed. And then, one day, he just stopped turning back. She tried to hold the pieces together with dinners, compliments, grace. But love, once cracked, starts to leak. And no matter how much you pour in, it keeps spilling through the seams. She stopped planning baby showers in her mind. She stopped knitting. She started sleeping with a pillow between them. It was easier that way, pretending there was still something between them, even if it was cotton. By the time the town started whispering, she had already stopped listening. People could be gentle with their curiosity, but gentleness could still cut deep. She'd pass someone at the bakery, and they'd give her that soft-lipped smile, the one that says I'm sorry without ever using words. It was worse than pity. It was recognition. People knew. Not just about the miscarriages, but about Caleb, about Lena. Small towns don't require announcements. One shadowy dinner in a booth too far from downtown. One lipstick smudge on a coffee cup in someone else's trash. And it spreads, not like wildfire, but like water under floorboards. Slow, certain, untraceable. Emily would walk through town square with her shoulders square and her hair pulled back, offering hellos like shields. She still wore her ring. Not because it meant something, but because taking it off would require admitting something out loud she wasn't ready to say. At church, she sat in the third pew alone. She could feel the eyes on her back, not cruel, but cautious. No one asked, no one offered, and she didn't blame them. People in small towns believe in privacy the way they believe in thunderstorms. You respect the air before it splits open. Caleb had stopped showing up entirely. People pretended not to notice. Emily would nod politely, hum along to the choir, and keep her lips from trembling. But inside, she counted the minutes. Not of the service, but of her life. How long had it been since he looked at her like she mattered? Since he brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, or pulled her into his chest, and breathed her in like something sacred? She didn't cry in church. Her tears belonged to the night, to the window seat by the kitchen, where she curled up with a blanket too thin for the cold and whispered old names she never got to use. The first time she saw Lena in person, it felt like swallowing glass. Caleb had brought her openly, shamelessly, to the fall fundraiser for the town's elementary school, a place Emily had volunteered at for years. Lena was tall, sharp-featured, and wore red like she had invented it. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Emily stood at the refreshment table, pouring lemonade for the children, and watched them from across the lawn like she was witnessing the unveiling of a secret she already knew. Caleb stood beside her, hand lightly on the small of Lena's back, his tie loosened just so. Emily didn't move. Her hands kept working. Her face didn't flinch. But her heart, it folded. Not because he was flaunting it. Not because the betrayal was fresh. But because in that moment she realized something colder. She didn't feel envy. She didn't feel rage. She felt nothing. And that frightened her more than anything. She walked away before he saw her, not because she was hiding, but because she knew there was nothing left to say. He had already said it, in all the nights he didn't come home, in all the words he never offered after the second miscarriage, in the long, slow way he stopped reaching for her hand. That night she went home and took off her wedding ring for the first time in 7 years. She placed it on the windowsill where the morning sun could catch it. She didn't cry, she didn't curse. She simply stood there, one hand on her belly, and whispered to the silence, "I forgive you." Not because he asked, not because he deserved it, but because her heart had carried enough weight, and it was finally time to let something go. The first time she met him, he didn't come with grand gestures or a smile that begged to be remembered. He simply stood on the front porch with a tape measure in one hand and a pencil tucked behind his ear, his flannel sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms like a man born to build things that lasted. She hadn't requested the repairs personally. The school had hired a local carpenter to fix the back porch steps before they collapsed under one more PTA gathering. Emily had only opened the door that Tuesday morning to let him in. But when she saw him standing there, tall, quiet, not in a rush to speak, something in her lungs drew still. His name was Daniel Miller. He said it plainly, as if it didn't need decoration. She stepped aside to let him through, mumbling something about the wood being soft near the middle board, and he nodded, crouching down to examine it without a word wasted. He didn't ask her personal questions. He didn't linger when she gave him space. And that, perhaps, was what caught her breath more than anything. For the first time in years, a man had entered her space without trying to take something from it. He measured the beams, made quiet notes in a worn notebook, and only looked up once, to thank her for the iced tea she'd left near his tool bag. That evening after he left, she realized she had stood near the window longer than necessary, watching him drive away. Not longing, not hoping, just wondering how a presence so still could make the air feel different. Daniel came back the next day, then the day after that. The porch wasn't a large job, but he worked like it was sacred, slow, deliberate, respectful of the grain in the wood. Emily found herself inventing errands near the back door, folding dish towels twice just to hear the creak of the screen when he came and went. He brought his daughter once, Rosie, a wide-eyed 7-year-old with curls that refused to be tamed and a laugh that broke through the quiet like spring sunlight. Emily gave her lemonade, and Rosie, in return, offered her a leaf she said looked like a heart. She kept it, pressed it between the pages of an old cookbook she hadn't opened in years. Daniel didn't speak much, but when he did, his words came from deep places, like stones pulled from the bottom of a river. He told her he'd lost his wife 3 years earlier to cancer. No bitterness, no theatrics, just fact, carried with the grace of someone who had walked through fire without letting it char his soul. "We all carry something," he said one afternoon, sanding the railings. Emily nodded, unsure if her silence was agreement or fear. She wanted to say something, anything, to match the courage it took to speak of death without anger. But all she could offer was another glass of lemonade and a glance that lasted too long. Still, he didn't shrink from it. He accepted her silence like a language he already understood. In the evenings, when she walked past the finished porch, she sometimes ran her hand across the railing he built, feeling the smooth wood beneath her palm like something human, something kind. She didn't fall in love. That would have been too easy. She simply began to return to herself, slowly, uncertainly, like a woman waking from too long a sleep. The days grew cooler, but she no longer noticed the cold quite as much. She started humming again, mostly when she cooked, or when she sorted through laundry on quiet Sundays. She swept the porch every morning, even if no one was visiting. And sometimes, when Daniel stopped by to drop off a bill or check on a loose post, they talked not deeply, not about the wounds they each carried, but about the weather, the school, Rosie's drawings. Small things, but in small things, trust is built. One Saturday afternoon, Emily brought over a pie to thank him for the work. Not because she was trying to impress him, but because it felt natural to do something kind for someone who hadn't asked her to be anything other than who she was. He didn't invite her in. He didn't need to. She stayed on the porch, sipping cider with Rosie while Daniel cleaned out the garage. It wasn't a date. It wasn't a beginning. It was a breath. A shared moment that didn't try to become more than what it was. And when she left, walking back to her car with the sound of Rosie's laughter trailing behind her, she felt something shift inside, not the rush of romance, the quiet return of peace. The first true change came in the form of dizziness. Emily dismissed it at first, too little sleep, too much tea, maybe stress. But when it happened a second time, and then again at the grocery store as she reached for a box of crackers, she paused. Her hands trembled slightly on the shopping cart. There had been no late nights, no skipped meals, no illness. Just this strange, fluttering weakness. It was a friend who asked the question, a teacher from school who noticed the paleness in her cheeks and the way she held her lower back like something ached deep inside. "Are you okay?" she'd asked gently, then added with a half-laugh, "You're not expecting, are you?" The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Emily smiled, forced, and said no, of course not. But something in her chest had already begun to shake loose. That night, long after the dishes were put away and the house was quiet again, she stood barefoot in the bathroom, holding the test in her hand like it might catch fire. She waited, heart in her throat, watching the seconds pass like lifetimes. When the faint pink lines appeared, she didn't gasp. She didn't fall to the floor in cinematic collapse. She simply stared, one hand over her stomach, as if to protect what she couldn't yet believe. And then, like a thread pulling loose from the corner of a tightly woven cloth, she whispered a name. Not for the baby, for herself, Emily, as if remembering she was still here, still whole, still able to carry something sacred inside her, not just life, but the truth that hope, when it returns, doesn't knock. It walks in quietly and sits with you until you recognize it. She didn't tell anyone at first. Not because she wanted to hide the pregnancy, but because the silence was too tender to be disturbed. It felt like a candle cupped in her hands, the flame still flickering from the wind of her doubt. She would wake in the early mornings before the sun turned the sky to gold, wrap her arms around herself, and sit on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of something new and ancient growing inside her. It wasn't fear she felt, not exactly. It was reverence. A cautious awe that this time, somehow, life had chosen to stay. Her body, which had once been a battlefield of loss, now felt like sacred ground. She walked differently, spoke more softly to herself, and listened to the hush between her heartbeats, as though they were the rhythm of a lullaby only she could hear. The days moved slowly but kindly. She read again, not novels, but baby books, folded pamphlets, short things that didn't overwhelm. She let herself smile without apology. The mornings grew colder as autumn deepened, but for the first time in years, she welcomed the chill. She'd sit on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders, the wind brushing through her hair, her hands gently resting on her belly like an anchor. It was the beginning of something, but it wasn't rushed. It grew quietly, a slow root winding its way back into the soil of hope. Even in her stillness, she bloomed. Telling Daniel came weeks later, and even then, she didn't know how to say it. They had grown closer, not through declarations or touch, but through the steady, thoughtful way two people lean toward warmth when they find it. He had begun stopping by more often, sometimes with Rosie, sometimes alone. Once he came just to fix a drawer that wouldn't close properly, and they ended up sitting on the kitchen floor sharing apples and stories about their fathers. It wasn't romantic in the usual sense. There were no lingering glances, no sudden sparks. It was quieter than that, like being handed a glass of water when you didn't realize you were thirsty. When she finally found the words, it wasn't in some dramatic confession. She simply stood beside him one afternoon as he replaced a hinge on a loose cabinet door, her voice steady but softer than usual. "I'm pregnant," she said, almost like a sigh. The screwdriver paused mid-turn. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, his eyes didn't flash with surprise. Instead, he met her gaze with a stillness so complete it held her there. "Are you okay?" he asked. Not "who's the father?" Not "what happens now?" Just that. "Are you okay?" And with those 3 words, something inside her loosened. She nodded, and he reached over, not to touch her belly, not to ask questions, but to set the screwdriver down gently, as though everything deserved softness now. That evening, he brought Rosie with him. They stayed for dinner. They didn't talk about the baby. They laughed about Rosie's school art project and how she had painted a cat with 6 legs just in case one broke. And when they left, Daniel placed his hand briefly on Emily's shoulder, not for ownership, not for promises, but for presence. For her, that was enough. As the months passed, Emily's world began to transform in quiet, unhurried layers. The nursery door, once a symbol of loss, was opened again, not with ceremony, but with slow intention. She repainted it, not in the butter yellow of the past, but in a soft sage green that reminded her of still mornings and new leaves. Daniel offered to help, but she chose to do most of it alone. Not out of stubbornness, but because she needed the time with her memories. She placed a rocking chair by the window and would sit there in the evenings, watching the last light fall across the floor while pressing her fingers to the curve of her stomach. The twins, because yes, there were 2, as the ultrasound had revealed, seemed to know when the world grew quiet. They moved most in the stillness, like little ripples in a hidden lake. Emily spoke to them often, not baby talk. Real talk. Stories, thoughts, the kind of words you offer someone you already trust. She told them about the dreams she used to have, the fears she no longer fed, and the kind of mother she hoped she could be, not perfect, but present. She no longer thought of Caleb. He existed in the past now, like a storm that had come through and left its mark, but was no longer part of the forecast. The town, too, had stopped whispering. Or maybe she had stopped listening. Either way, her peace was no longer something that needed defending. It simply was. Her doctor visits were calm, almost sacred. She walked into the office each time with a quiet courage, greeting the nurses by name, answering questions with steady eyes. The first time she heard both heartbeats at once, she cried, not with sorrow, but with reverence. 2 lives, 2 chances, 2 fresh beginnings nestled inside her. She told Daniel about the appointment over dinner one night, and he had simply nodded, his smile slow and deep. "You're going to be good at this," he said. She didn't ask what this meant. She didn't need to. One crisp evening, when the stars had just begun to peek through the clouds, Daniel walked her out to the porch before heading home. They didn't speak much. Rosie had fallen asleep in the truck, her head against the window, mouth slightly open. Emily stood with one hand resting on her stomach, the other holding the edge of her shawl. Daniel turned toward her before leaving. He looked at her belly, then at her face, then said, "You look like someone who survived the flood and planted flowers anyway." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply smiled, leaned against the porch railing he had built, and looked out at the night. Her life no longer needed fixing. It had been rebuilt, not by miracles or men, but by the slow, steady act of choosing to keep breathing every day, even when it hurt. And in that, she had found something stronger than happiness. She had found peace. The wind carried something different that morning, as though the world itself had been reset. The late autumn air felt less like an end and more like a quiet inhale before a beginning. Emily stepped outside with a wool scarf wrapped snug around her neck, the kind Daniel had gifted her last month without ceremony, just folded and left on her porch swing, as if knowing she wouldn't want a gesture, only the warmth. The leaves were brittle now, scattered in russet and gold across the lawn, whispering under her boots as she walked toward the gate. There was a lightness to her, not the weightless kind that comes from joy, but the grounded kind that comes from release. At 7 months pregnant, her body ached in ways she had forgotten were possible. Hips that groaned under her frame, feet that swelled without warning, dreams interrupted by little kicks and rolls inside her that made her gasp in the dark. And yet, she had never known a deeper kind of contentment. Not the loud kind, the private sacred kind, the kind you don't post about, the kind you don't explain. People in town no longer looked at her with questions. Their curiosity had burned out quietly, replaced by soft nods and small smiles that spoke of respect, not gossip. Perhaps they had seen enough to know now that her story wasn't a scandal, but a resurrection. And she walked like a woman who had pulled herself from the fire and decided not to apologize for still standing. That afternoon, there was a fundraiser at the local school, a harvest fair filled with cinnamon and cider and the laughter of children chasing after painted pumpkins. Emily had been invited weeks ago, gently encouraged by an old teacher friend who had said, "It's been too long since we saw you with joy in your eyes." She'd almost declined. The idea of crowds, of seeing people from a past she had laid to rest, unsettled something in her. But Rosie had begged her to come, wanted her to see the art she'd made with paper leaves and glue, and Emily couldn't say no to that sweet, gap-toothed smile. So she came. She wore a soft blue dress that flowed gently over her growing belly and pulled her hair back into a loose braid. She didn't try to look perfect. She didn't have to anymore. She arrived early, walked slowly, greeted familiar faces with grace and not a trace of apology. It was Rosie who spotted her first, running over with paint-stained fingers and throwing her arms around Emily's waist with no hesitation. Behind her, Daniel approached, not hurried, not hesitant, just present. Their eyes met, and for a moment the noise around them dulled, as if the universe had quieted itself to witness something gentle unfold. They spoke briefly, easily, laughed about Rosie's messy hair and the way her painted turkey looked more like a lopsided turtle. They didn't talk about what they were. There was no need for labels. What existed between them didn't ask to be named. It just was. And then Caleb arrived, unannounced, uninvited, and unmistakably unchanged. He stepped onto the fairground like a man stepping into old territory, flanked by Lena, her belly round, her walk practiced, her dress too tight for the wind. Emily saw them before they saw her. It was instinctual, the way her spine straightened, how her fingers tightened slightly on the rim of the cider cup in her hand. Caleb hadn't aged, not really. His hair was a little thinner, maybe his face less open, but his swagger was intact. He was smiling, laughing too loud at nothing in particular. He looked like a man trying to pretend he wasn't haunted. Lena held onto his arm as if she needed to anchor him or herself. Their presence sent a ripple through the crowd, just enough for some heads to turn. Caleb scanned the faces, expecting recognition, admiration maybe. But instead, he caught a glimpse of Emily. And the air changed, he slowed. His smile faltered, his steps grew uncertain. She didn't move, didn't look away. She stood there, calm, hand resting gently on her belly, Daniel at her side, Rosie clinging to her arm. Caleb froze as if he had just seen a ghost. But it wasn't a ghost standing in front of him. It was the woman he had abandoned, radiant in a way pain can't touch, surrounded by a life he had never thought she'd be strong enough to build without him. And in that moment, he wasn't the man who had left. He was the man who had been left behind. He approached eventually, slow and unsure, like a man walking through fog he thought he controlled. Lena lingered behind, not interested in confrontation, suddenly more curious about the food stand than the woman she had once replaced. Caleb stopped just a few feet away, eyes flickering from Emily's stomach to her face, searching for weakness, maybe even hoping for it. But what he found was stillness. Not the brittle stillness of someone holding in tears, but the steady calm of someone who no longer needed to explain her healing to the one who caused her wounds. "Emily," he said, his voice unfamiliar now, like a song she used to know but no longer remembered the words to. "Didn't expect to see you here." She didn't flinch. She didn't offer a smile. "I live here," she said simply, her voice low, strong, unbothered. Caleb opened his mouth again, but Daniel stepped closer then, not possessively, not to challenge, but simply to stand beside her, to be known. Caleb noticed, of course. His eyes narrowed briefly, but he masked it with a weak smile. "You look different," he said. "Better." Emily tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Peace does that. There was a pause, long enough for Caleb to feel it. He looked at Rosie, then at Daniel, then back at Emily. "Twins?" he asked, nodding at her stomach. She nodded once. "Yes." He let out a breath, half laugh, half disbelief. "Well, guess we both got what we wanted." She didn't answer. Not because she was angry, but because there was nothing to answer. Some endings speak for themselves. Caleb looked down, then offered a final shrug. "You look happy," he said. Emily gave a slow nod, her hand still on her belly, Daniel's warmth steady beside her. "I am," she said. "I truly am." Labor came not with violence, but with a quiet insistence, like rain beginning to fall just as you step out to walk. It was early, not by the calendar, but by the morning before the town stirred, while the sky still wore its velvet hush. Emily had been awake for hours, unable to sleep through the restless stirrings in her body. She had grown used to the twins kicking, shifting like fish beneath the surface. But that morning their movements were slower, lower, pressing down with a rhythm she hadn't felt before. The air in the bedroom felt different, thick, and expectant. She sat up carefully, one hand on the small of her back, the other resting instinctively over the firm swell of her stomach. The silence of the house wrapped around her, but it was no longer the echoing silence of sorrow. It was sacred now, the kind of silence a soul creates when it's ready to meet something divine. She stood, slowly, steadying herself on the edge of the bed, and made her way to the kitchen. The kettle was already warm, the lights low. She didn't panic. She didn't rush. She simply leaned against the counter and waited, letting her breath move in and out like waves against the shore. When Daniel arrived, earlier than usual, having promised to drive her to her final appointment, she looked at him with a calm that startled them both. "It's time," she said. He blinked, and then nodded, the softest expression of readiness rising in his eyes. They left quietly, with only the porch light left on, as though the house itself was bowing its head for a prayer. The birth was not easy, but it was not unkind. It demanded more from her body than she had ever given, but it gave back in ways that would echo forever. She moved through each contraction with her jaw clenched, eyes closed, breath steady, Daniel's hand in hers, anchoring her with a strength that asked for nothing in return. Hours passed in a blur of white linens, whispered encouragements, and the deep, animal sound of a woman letting go of everything she no longer needed to carry. The moment the first baby cried, it was as if the sound split the air and stitched it back together all at once. The second followed quickly, smaller, quieter, but with eyes wide open as if already curious about the world. They placed them both on her chest, warm and wet and real, and she broke open, not in grief, but in awe. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her heart was too full of something beyond language. Daniel stood nearby, not touching, just watching, his eyes rimmed red, his body rigid with emotion he wasn't used to letting show. When one of the nurses asked if he was the father, Emily looked at him, then at the babies, and answered without hesitation. He's family, she said. And it was true, not by blood, not by rings or titles, but by something deeper. He had shown up in her life like a whispered promise, and stayed like a vow. They named them Matthew and Micah, names she had once written in a notebook she thought she'd never open again. The hospital room was filled with light by the time the sun rose. Rosie came later that day, skipping through the door with a handmade card and 2 tiny hats she had helped knit. She climbed onto the bed beside Emily with the awkward grace of a child trying to be careful and reached out to touch each baby's foot with wide-eyed reverence. Daniel hovered at the edge of the room for a moment before stepping closer, one hand resting lightly on the back of Rosie's shoulder. There was no fanfare, no announcements. No one in the room needed proof that a family had just been born. It existed in the quiet glances, in the way Rosie looked at Emily like she was the safest place on earth, in the way Daniel picked up one of the babies like he'd been practicing in his sleep. Emily watched them, the 3 of them, and let herself breathe in the moment fully, without fear of what might come next. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for the floor to fall out from under her. She wasn't clutching at life, afraid it might vanish. She was rooted, present, and the presence was enough. There was no ghost of Caleb in that room. No echo of what she'd lost. Only what she had made, what she had chosen, what had chosen her in return. They went home 3 days later, the sky outside pale with the promise of snow. Daniel drove slowly, carefully, as though the babies could feel the curves in the road. Emily sat in the back seat between the car seats, humming softly to them, her eyes never leaving their faces. The house welcomed them like it had been waiting its whole life to be filled this way. Rosie ran ahead, throwing open the nursery door and announcing, "They're here," to no one in particular. The room looked different now, not just in color or design, but in spirit. It no longer held memories of pain or mourning. It had been rewritten, every drawer, every blanket, every soft lamp casting gentle shadows on the walls. That night, Emily rocked them one at a time in the chair by the window, the wind whispering outside, a world gone quiet. She thought of every version of herself that had once dreamed of this moment. The young girl with wide eyes. The wife who whispered names in the dark. The woman who stood alone at the sink while betrayal crept in through the door. All of them lived in her still, but none of them held the pen anymore. She was not just reborn, she was reclaimed. Before she went to bed, she walked to the small drawer by her bed, opened it, and pulled out the velvet box that still held her old wedding ring. She didn't cry. She simply looked at it for a long time. Then she closed the box and placed it deep in the back of the drawer. It didn't belong to this chapter. Not anymore. Then she turned off the light and let peace settle beside her like a second heartbeat, steady and whole.